Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fourth Eye Podcast. This is your host, Ryan Webster. So, this episode is going to be a little bit of an experiment. I kind of have an idea, and actually, before I get into things, I should say that a little bit about my process for how I record these. I generally don't have notes or anything in front of me, so I just kind of go off the cuff a little bit. But I generally have a topic in mind, and I'll spend often, a couple of hours sitting and pondering and kind of getting my thoughts in order and figuring out what I want to say. And one of the questions that I'll generally ask is, is this useful to others? Is this something? And I don't worry so much about whether or not what I'm saying is esoteric. But what I try to think about is, will someone be able to get value out of this? Will this further a conversation? Will it take something in a direction that I think something needs to go? Is it going to offer, am I doing some kind of work that's valuable and that wouldn't be best done by someone other than myself? And those are kind of the general shape of the questions that I try to ask myself. And so I was listening to, as I often do, excuse me, a couple of podcasts, and I was thinking about what I've talked about recently with regards to reforming the education system. And now I've taken a moment to look at, and it wasn't really intentional, but I've been looking at, I wouldn't call it prison reform, but it's something like that. I've taken an interest in the kind of butterfly effect and as it relates to criminality. And as you might imagine, and I'm not the first one to notice this, it strikes me as a very, very sad thing that many of the people who end up, it seems, in trouble often are people who've been incarcerated for, we'll say, most of their lives in some cases, in many cases. Basically, and I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that none of what I'm saying here is meant to be a distraction from the often horrible, horrible choices that these people make and the people that they harm and the things that happen. I'm not excusing any of that. But I think it's worth mentioning that many of these criminals have led, at least in many respects, mental lives that have many, many, many similarities and a lot of overlap with our own lives, especially in childhood. And I think the primary differences, obviously, are drugs and violence, are typically the things that are absent from the lives of people that aren't incarcerated, or if not absent, then at least they're not, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let's put it that way, because we do know that there are some people who do the same things that many children do, and many adolescents and young adults and so on and so forth, and even older adults, really, which is, smoke some pot, make a few mistakes, hit a baseball into someone's window. I'm not saying that is a common event, but something like that happens, and you just happen to be faced with the wrong person to eke out your punishment. And somebody calls the cops, and you end up with the wrong cop. And next thing you know, you're on a path, and you've got a certain psychology, you've got a certain home environment, you've made certain bad choices. And so this is the other thing that I want to say, is that I appreciate the fact, or perhaps not the fact, but the concept that it's likely the bad choices that people make, myself included, that allow us to be unlucky in the first place. I recognize that. And the opposite is also true. People, and probably going to talk about this a lot on this podcast and on my blog, the kind of vision of success that many of us have, this kind of ideal human being those people get lucky, but they get lucky because they have done the things that have allowed them to be in the right places at the right time, and that's very, very important. And criminals sort of operate at the opposite end of the spectrum. But the thing that I think is important is that in both cases, probability and chance and so on and so forth is involved. And probably more than that, the thing that's worth pointing out is that the people, and I also want to say, before I say much more and potentially embarrass myself, which I'm not particularly concerned about, but I say it kind of tongue-in-cheek, I am not at all well researched in this topic. I'm coming at this with a fresh perspective, and I'm coming at it, I guess, first with trying to understand from the point of sort of functionality and ethics if the way that we're doing justice right now makes sense. And I'm speaking specifically about in the States, but I think this could probably be relatable to how we do justice in a variety of places. Or really just how we think about justice as human beings, because we share a common evolutionary history and a common basal wiring, and we share a common sort of set of apish instincts and heuristics and so on and so forth. And I'm trying to figure out I'm not exactly sure what it is yet, but I think that there's something that the problems that we have, and I'm not sure what it is yet, not because I can't figure out an answer if I thought about it. It's more that I just haven't thought about it, and so I'll probably do that here in real time. But there seems to me to be something that is the same, or at least similar, between our problem in prisons and with understanding our institutions of incarceration and the justice system and so on and so forth, and the problem of educational reform. I think there's some parallels there. And one of the things that comes to mind, because as I said, I'm just going to kind of think about this in real time, and that's what makes this an experiment, is that I'm doing this especially without knowing what the hell I'm talking about. But, well, to go into that a little bit, not only do I not know what I'm talking about, but this is, if nothing else, an attempt to sort of play out my thoughts and see if my reasoning makes any sense to someone else, and also to get feedback from other people and stories and so on and so forth. And I don't really care if they're anecdotes or if you want to provide me with data. Both are greatly appreciated. But I want to get a sense of what the hell's going on here and how I can better understand it. And the reason for that is because I specifically, I think, unlike many people, and I don't want to get into this at this moment, I might get into it later, unlike many other people, I'm interested in action. And actually, I guess I'm going to get into it now. This relates to what I was about to say, which is that I think the common thread between the problems that we're having with educational reform, or the reform of the education system, and the reform of our justice system, is that when it's very much like the intuitions, or it's very much similar to the reduction in the empathic response and sort of altruism if you, say, show someone a picture of a kid and then add another kid. And in terms of donations and so on and so forth, this is an example that Sam Harris uses quite frequently, so some of you might recognize it. But basically, I think it applies to this problem in institutions, which is that, and I don't know the scientific name for the phenomenon, I'm sure there is one, but that people are conceptualizing the problem to be so big that they know it's probably not good, but it's actually so big and so complex that not only do people not act, but they actually don't make any attempts to think about alternatives and to remove themselves, to remove others, and to remove, in the case of education, and probably even incarceration, to remove their children from such circumstances, or to remove their children from what they, with their friends, might consider to be an abhorrent institution. And then when they're faced with a real decision of, am I going to send my kid to public school? It's like they do every time. And it doesn't surprise me that that's the case particularly, or confuse me. I mean, I can understand that the problem is expansive and that there aren't necessarily good alternatives to public school. So even if you believe on some level, even if it's just an instinct that you haven't quite articulated, that the education system or that some big institution needs to be reformed, well, it isn't necessarily obvious to you how you should go about doing that. And then it's also not obvious what alternatives there are, so you can't necessarily opt out and so on. So basically what I'm saying is that I think the missing element from really how we're thinking about, it seems like every institution that I can think of off the top of my head, just anything that you'd call an institution, anything that's got a lot of people in it and a lot of incentives and it's complex and there's a lot going on. It seems that humans are very, very bad at this moment in history, say, at improving institutions, right? So to take a very current example with a phenomenon like the intellectual dark web, if you're familiar with the term, which, at least as far as I can tell, describes a group of mostly individuals that aren't necessarily backed by any corporate incentives or anything like that in particular, that are just speaking out and that are appreciating, along with what might actually be like millions of people. I don't know exactly how many people are agreeing with this yet, but that are, as they've often been called, our sort of communal sense-making apparatus or institutions and so on and so forth, and journalism and news and things like that are sort of falling apart. And I've been thinking about, probably for half a year at this point, probably longer, probably more like a year actually, about creating or I don't know. I mean, generally I like to do things myself, so I'd be perfectly willing to start the business myself. But most importantly, I just want to contribute to solving this problem of how we can get news that is actually news, and that is, if it's swaying us, and I've thought about it somewhat, I get the sense that no matter what you do, there's always, well, let me break this down a little bit. So this is something that Eric Weinstein has been talking about quite a bit, which is kind of the problem with media. And one of the things he talks about is that if you're looking at, well, we'll just take a site like YouTube because it's the one that I know the best. There is always going to be an algorithm that decides what videos you see, right? Since there's a finite amount of slots that immediately hit your eye when you go to the homepage on your YouTube. And there are a number of different ways that can be filtered, but the reality of it is that it's always filtered somehow, right? Even simply having videos go up in the order that they were released, most recently uploaded with this certain amount of views or whatever it is, or something like that, that's still a way of sorting. And there's various ways of sorting, and I don't have to go into that too much, but you can think of a couple, like sorting based on how many likes something gets, or how many views, or whatever it is, or maybe someone pays to get their video put up on the homepage of YouTube, which is obviously a very real and obvious thing that can and does happen. And well, to me, the problem is, you can probably conceive that of those options, if we're just talking about sorting mechanisms on the table, there are probably one or a few options there that are better than the others in terms of being objective and getting yourself further and further away from the bad part of tribalism. And to me, I think, even though I don't think we should attempt to do anything at all that's flavored like enforcing people to enjoy a wide variety of content. But I think we have an obligation, because of where not making any effort to help people to understand why enjoying a variety of content is so crucial to not developing this kind of echo chamber. Because I think the echo chamber is the thing that's created the phenomenon that we're seeing in the humanities on college campuses now. And I would say that that is either a reflection of, and probably both, probably a reflection and in some ways the breeding grounds for the phenomenon and the rise of far left ideologies being propped up in the news and in the mainstream. And that's actually something that's confused me a lot. And I don't want to sort of jump into that too much now, because I'm not interested in playing to any particular position. And I know people like Dave Rubin get shut down for trying to play centrist, but I actually am a centrist, whether he is or not, libertarian and so on and so forth. I think his position, although I'm not even sure that perfectly encapsulates what he is. But to me, I think using the label of being a Democrat or Republican or a liberal or conservative or alt-right or alt-left, I suppose at this point, or any of these bizarre terms that we have, I don't think that those boxes are particularly helpful. And we might say it's convenient at a dinner party if you want to tell someone effectively what temperament you have or what kinds of things you might believe without having to give them your life story. And I appreciate that. I really do. But I really think even at a dinner party and with friends, it's really worth your time to develop your ideas over time as you hang out with them in any situation, and really give them opportunities to appreciate the nuance in your arguments. Because, I don't know, I'm going off a little bit here, but I think as nuance has been lost because people are getting lower and lower resolution pictures of reality because everything is so scattered right now. I think nuance has been lost, and I think the problem is that as soon as you use some kind of label and you say, I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative or whatever the hell else you want to call yourself, you put yourself in this box and you've lowered the resolution, right? Now, as I've said, there's advantages to that in one sense, and yet I don't think that they actually outweigh the advantages of not doing that. I think there's more disadvantages than advantages, and the perceived advantages aren't really all that great, right? I mean, because what are you really doing? Politics, even if it's not something you particularly enjoy to talk about, is potentially divisive and important. Like if someone asks you, what do you believe about X? What do you think about abortion? How do you think we should address, quote unquote, growing the economy or fixing the economic problems? Or what are your views on taxation, broadly speaking, and then at the state level, and so on and so forth? I mean, you can get into the weeds. It doesn't, you don't respond to that by saying, oh, well, here's my political affiliation. Like, you actually get into the weeds of your specific argument and you lay out the details, because that's where the devil is, or the potential devil anyway. And that's where you sharpen each other up, hopefully, or maybe you just have a terrible exchange. But anyway, the point being, I think echo chambers are bad. I think most of us have a sense of that, but I think that there are legitimately, I don't know if it's a growing number. I'm not going to make that assertion because I don't have that data, but it seems like there is a vast amount of very squeaky wheels, and it's probably still a vast minority is what I would call it. But there's a lot of squeaky wheels of people who, whether they understand what I'm saying or not, they've built this echo chamber. And I think we have a responsibility now to actually try to steelman their positions and to work with them, instead of trying to either pretend they don't exist, call them idiots, so on and so forth, or even worse, even worse, try to understand them through a very low resolution picture and look only at their intentions, and then don't appreciate the subtleties of their arguments. Because, and here's a good example, right? If you're on the left and you say something like, well, I believe in equality of opportunity. Okay, sounds good. And then you take that a step further and you're like, well, I think we have a huge inequality problem, and I think it would be great if we could just level the playing field somehow. And then you ask them, well, what does that mean? And they go, well, something like equality of something like equity, or something like equality of outcome, right? And the problem is that unless you understand the history, unless you think about it for a moment, because of the language being used, and specifically the types of people that it comes from, who are very compassionate motherfuckers, frankly, in many cases, or they think they are, the argument is delivered. It's not even really an argument, but the position is delivered in such a way that it seems much less bad than it actually is. And because I don't want to do 40 minutes on socialism and why that's not good, or communism, et cetera, because I think, I don't need to do that, because I think we all kind of get why those things don't work so well at this point. But more than that, I just don't want this podcast to be 3 hours long when I try to really get into the weeds of why it doesn't work, and get into evolution and like the fucking laws of the universe. That's pretty much how fundamental, capitalism and survival of the fittest and things like that are. But anyway, not getting into that. I mean, it's you can understand why positing an argument like, oh, we should strive for equity or quality of outcome, might sound good, and it might be something that's easy to deliver and get yourself on the news with. But if you're a Nazi, you can't do that, because it's obvious to everybody that your ideas are abhorrent, except maybe the Nazis, and there aren't many of them. So the problem that we're running into at this point is that we're creating echo chambers, and we're not dealing with the problem, right? And the way that it seems that we can deal with the problem is like with Nazis. We put them in a box, and we have everybody work to shut them down. Like, everybody knows it's not okay to be a Nazi, but not everybody knows that it's not okay to be a communist, and that's a real problem. It's a real problem, right? Because, in many ways you can argue that communism has killed far more people than Hitler ever did, right? Or than, him and his guys did, frankly, right? But that's not what you hear, right? Because we don't hear about how bad some of these other leaders were, in the 20th century. And not to get into that too much, but I think, and frankly, I fully understand. I want to say this to, again, sort of caveat here, that I understand that communism, although not good, isn't necessarily malevolent on its own. It's just dysfunctional. Right, so I appreciate that communism and socialism don't have intent, and maybe there is some civilization of some size and scale where it would work. I'm not necessarily saying that isn't true, but I think based on what humans want, and based on what seems to be true, that you get what you incentivize, it's not very sustainable, right? It might work for a month until you realize that nobody wants to do any work. And nobody actually can get excited about innovating, because there's no way to, I hate to say it, get ahead and rise in a hierarchy, because you've basically removed them. You can't remove hierarchies, but they try. Anyway, coming back, I know this was supposed to be more about prison and educational reform, but yes, I think the problems that we're facing here is because of this kind of groupthink, and I think, well, what I'm trying to do now, and I'm still working on it, so bear with me, is to understand how we can fix the groupthink problem, and how we can fix the fake news problem. My only theory is that, and this is actually kind of a weird idea, I don't know how this will sound, but I think getting news is something that can't be contingent upon having to trust reporters. Because the second there is an incentive for the reporter to lie, and having said that, I realize that machines and bots or whatever else can be manipulated as well. I'm not insensitive to that point. I realize that, but I think there's a problem here, because unlike with sort of these automated systems and algorithms, if done well, humans are very susceptible to mood fluctuations and fluctuations in political opinions based on appeals to our intuitions that we can't always perfectly keep in check. And so there will be many cases when Mark Zuckerberg thinks that he is doing a fantastic job and he is not doing such a fantastic job. And that is how humans work. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily even his fault or that he's a bad guy. Like, I don't know him. I don't think he's evil. I don't think the word evil really applies to anyone, but it certainly doesn't apply to him, or it doesn't apply to many people. If it should apply to some people, let's put it that way. But anyway, yeah, I think like getting news isn't something that can be tied to whether or not your reporter is trustworthy, because whether we believe it or not, that can change very quickly based on the incentives, right? Somebody who has every incentive to be dishonest, or every incentive to self-censor, or every incentive to emphasize certain things and not others, which is manipulating you, even if it's not necessarily obvious, and even if it's not necessarily bad, it's still a manipulation of your attention, of, look at this word or look at this picture and not other things. And I'm not saying we're going to avoid that. And I'm not even necessarily saying that the solution is to get rid of people and to get rid of journalists. I think the thing is that it's difficult to be a proper, successful journalist with a team and everything, and be public, and to have people investing into that, and to have those incentives, and to offer quality news. I think it's the same problem that we're seeing in food, which is that large companies have every incentive to not treat the animals so well, right? And so we actually need is to have that replaced with, oddly, or at least this is my view, and maybe you'll put me on the right because it sounds like a small government argument, but I think we need local, sustainable, organic farms where you know the name of the cow you're eating if you eat meat, et cetera, and you know what's in your soil and everything like that. I think that's very important. And I think that's actually what we need with journalism at this moment in history. We need to know what's in our soil. We need to know what's in the water. We need to know that we're not being poisoned by mercury when we eat our tuna, and so on and so forth. And right now we don't know those things. And the fact that we can be poisoned or given a low dose of bullshit without knowing it, and then have that develop slowly and sort of accumulate over years and years and years, is a serious problem. And I don't know how we're going to deal with it. But I will do more thinking about that. But anyway, since I don't want to veer too much off of the other points about prison reform and so on, I think actually what I should say is that the way that news relates in all that is that news and the sense-making apparatus is the way that we have a dialogue and the way that we educate ourselves. And I think the problem is, at least in part, that we're doing a very poor job of talking to each other and getting higher and higher resolution pictures of what our neighbors think rather than lower and lower ones. I think the problem is that we're looking at the world through a straw, and we're looking at things with lower and lower resolutions, which, yeah, fine, that's great if you're dealing with all the data that we deal with in the 21st century. The problem is that you don't know anything. You're getting a lot of noise and not a whole lot of signal. And I think now what we need to do is we need to learn how to dig deeper and be human again, and have conversations where you know the name and the face of the person you're talking to, and you have a sense of community, and you have a sense of empathy and a sense of goodwill, both in yourself and on the other side, and you have a sense that you can trust them because you don't have all of these weird incentives and poison in the water that you don't even know about. I think that's sort of the state that we need to get to. So anyway, I know I've said this 26 times now, but I want to get thinking about that. I hope that you, if you weren't already, the listener, start thinking about that, and hopefully it'll help me do it. And I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this experiment cast here. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I guess I'll see you in the next podcast. Hope you have a wonderful day.